Hi, I'm Stuart and welcome to the channel. Well, we had a lovely hot summer here in the north of England, so much so that it caused drought conditions. But now it seems to have changed and we've got a lot of cold and rainy weather. I'm still hopeful of getting out sometime before Christmas, but for the moment we're stuck in the garage. So my thoughts were starting to turn to what we can do with Rita and our winter projects. Now, one of the issues with Rita is the suspension is very crude and basic, built down to a price. The front forks are 38mm Paolis, and a lot of trials bikes of the time use them, but these are unadjustable and not able to be changed much at all. Even the spring rate, I can't get a replacement set of springs for it. So if we're going to do anything to it, we're going to need to move to one of the better sets of Paoli 38mm. I say lots of trials bike use them around this period, and most of them had damping control and changeable springs. So I think we'll look for a set of those to graft onto the front of Rita. Once we do that, of course, it's going to show up the ollie shock at the back as again being very crude and poor quality. So I think we need to upgrade that to a better quality shock to try and match the improvement we're going to make to the front. I think over this winter we'll also have a look at this seat. The cover on it is now cracked and splitting, and it's always been really uncomfortable. So I think while the bike's apart, we'll get this off and send it to a local upholsterer for a new cover and maybe some different quality foam underneath there. So today we're going to talk about setup. Whenever you get a new bike or you change anything on the suspension, you really need to look at the setup of the suspension to get the ride exactly right for you. Now, there's only two variables, it's quite simple. There's damping and there's spring preload. Those are the only things we need to get sorted out. Now, on the damping side, it's something that I can't really do in the garage. I need to do that on the move. Basically, inside the fork and inside the shock, there's a piston with holes in it, and we force oil through those holes. Now, what that does is that instead of the spring just bouncing up and down continuously, it actually slows the spring and will stop it moving too much. Now, on a dirt bike like this, I think you want the damping as light as you possibly can go. When you hit a big stone, what you don't want is for it to be slowing the suspension, because what will happen is that when you try to push the oil through the holes, it will actually lock up solid because it can't get through fast enough, and you get this hard jolt. And if there's harshness in the suspension, more often than not it's because the damping is wrong. Now on this I've got damping adjusters, so I'm going to set those to be on their minimum so that I get the softest ride possible, and then if I find that there's any pogoing effect, I'll add a little bit more damping to get rid of it. So I would always say start as light as you can, and if it feels it's a bit too bouncy, then add more damping to slow down the bounce and damp it out. Now on the old forks we had no damping adjustment, so my recommendation for the old beta forks was to go down as low as 2.5 weight oil, and I found that that gave the best response. It allowed the suspension to move freely without the oil affecting it, but it stopped it tilting backwards and forwards or bouncing too much when it went over a bump. Right, these are the new 38mm Paolis, and you can see there's a damping adjuster on the top of the fork leg here. Now I've currently got 5 weight oil in here, which is what the recommendation was, but I'm actually going to turn this adjuster anti-clockwise as far as it can go, so we've got absolutely minimum amount of damping on there. If I find that it's too bouncy, I can start to add more damping. If I still feel that it's a bit slow on the suspension, it's not allowing it to move freely, then I'll switch down to a 2.5 weight oil and we'll try again. But for now, that's all I can do. On the back end there is no damping adjustment, so we just have to live with what we've got. Right, let's move on to preload. So preload is all about getting the springs working in the best range. When you put your weight onto the bike, it's going to sink down to somewhere in the middle of the springs range, and we want to make sure that we're at the right point then. Now, when you do measure do your measurements for the preload, you need to decide whether you're going to measure it when you're sat down or when you're standing up. If you're sat down, all your weight is further back on the seat. If you're standing up, then all the weight is through the pegs, which is further forward. So I'd advise you to decide which is going to be most important to you, the performance sitting down or the performance when you're standing up, and set your preload accordingly. So in order to set the spring into the middle of its working range, first of all we need to know how much movement there is. So somewhere you'll be able to find the specs for your bike or for the fork that tell you the free range of movement. So what's the maximum wheel movement that you're going to get? Now, I generally work then on setting my preload to be 1/3 of that available movement. So I've looked up the specs for the shock and for the front forks. Now on these front forks there's 185 millimeters of movement. So if I set my sag to 62 millimeters, that means that I'm at 1/3 of the spring has been used up. 2/3 of the spring is still available for movement. On the back there's a wheel movement of 180 millimeters. So on the back we're going to go for 60 millimeters of sag. So sag is just the difference between the spring being unloaded and the spring being loaded. So how much does it sink when we're actually on the bike? And normally you would use this with a tape measure, get somebody to help you while you're standing on the bike. But I haven't got anyone to help me today, so I'm going to try and use a laser measure, fasten it to the bike and then measure to a fixed object. It's always key to measure to the same objects from the same place, then you can measure how things have moved. So the first thing we need to do is set up the measurement with no weight on the springs at all. Let's do that. So we've got the laser measure fastened to the side of the headlight, and if we push the button we can see that the light is actually hitting the bottom of the fork leg. So now I can measure how the forks are compressing when we're doing our measurements. So our first measurement is with the front wheel off the ground to get the fully extended point. 1204. Now it doesn't actually matter what the measurement is, what we're looking for is the difference between the two measurements. So that's the critical part. Right, our second measurement is going to be with the bike sitting with all its weight on the forks but nobody on the bike. Now I'm just going to bounce the suspension a little bit just to make sure it's not sticking at any point, and we'll take that measurement. Now this measurement is called the static sag, and it's not really that important, but I'll explain the use of it later. The most important thing is what they call the dynamic sag, and that's with me actually on the bike. Right, to measure our dynamic sag we need to be up on the bike, and I'm in the position that I would normally be. Again, just flex the suspension slightly, make sure it's not sticking at any point, and take our measurement. Now I'm actually keeping my weight fully through the bike and just balancing against the wall here. Right, move on to the rear end now and do exactly the same thing. I've got the measure taped on at the back, so we'll start with it unloaded. Right, with all of our numbers recorded, we can go do the maths on it. Right, let's crunch some numbers. So I'm measuring everything in millimetres. So my free wheel travel measures out at 185 millimetres. So if I take a third of that, I get 62 millimetres. So that's the target that we're aiming for, is 1/3 of available wheel travel is taken up just by me being on the bike. So then our measurements when it was loaded, we got 724 millimetres. And then when we dropped the bike onto its wheels, we got 684, which gives a static sag of 40 millimetres. Now the only reason that's important is that if you drop it onto its wheels and there is no sag at all, then your spring is too stiff or you've got too much preload on. So once you've got your preload set, just check the static sag, and as long as there is some movement there, then that's okay. So that's the only thing I would use it for, is just making sure that we're not really oversprung on the front fork. Then once I got onto the bike, we got a measurement of 658, which equals 66. So you can see we were aiming that we would only sink 62 millimetres. We actually sank 66 millimetres. So we need to lift the bike up by 4 millimetres when I'm on it. Right, moving on to the rear. The wheel travel on the Beta Alp is 180 millimetres. So it's easy, if we take a third of that, we're looking for 60 millimetres of sag. Now my measurements with no weight on the bike were 515 millimetres. And then as soon as it was on its wheels, it was 495, which equals 20 millimetres of static sag. And again, that's some movement, so we're not oversprung, so I'm happy with that. And then when I was on the bike, we went to 456, which is 59 millimetres. So we're only 1 millimetre out. I'm not actually going to chase that 1 millimetre. That could just be a measuring issue. It's not surprising that we are close, because I did take the measurements off the old shock before I put the new shock in, so it's no surprise that we're pretty close. So I'm going to call that good for the rear, and we need to add some preload onto the front. So once we've got our figures, if the figures show the bike is sinking too much, like mine was, then we need to add a little bit of preload to lift the bike up some more and stop it sinking quite as much. If the figures show the bike isn't sinking enough, then we need to remove some preload to make it sag even more. Now in my case, we had a little bit too much sinking, so I need to just add a touch of preload to bring it back up again. So if we look at these new Paoli forks I've put in, on top of the left hand leg there's actually a preload adjuster. If I turn it clockwise, it'll screw in and add more preload. If I turn it anti-clockwise, it'll screw out and reduce the amount of preload. Now on the older Paoli forks that were unadjustable, if you strip them down, you'll find some plastic spacers in the top of the fork legs, and they're sitting on top of the springs. If you increase the size of that spacer, then you're increasing the preload. If you reduce the size of that spacer, you're reducing the preload. So we had slightly too much sag going on, so we just need to put a slight amount of preload on there to take out that few millimetres of sag. So that's it for the garage setup. The next job will be to go out and do a road test on it. What we really need though is some better weather, so I can do that. When we do that, what I'll be looking for is doing a braking test and seeing if it dives too much at the front. Does it bounce after we finish braking? Does it recover and bounce up and down, or does it come up nice and smoothly? Do an acceleration test as much as Rita can manage, and see if it sits down on the tail when we accelerate. Then we'll be doing some off-road tests, see if the suspension feels harsh, see if it feels too soft. and also go over the same bump or the same hole with front and rear, and really think about how it feels when it goes over that obstacle. So what we want is that the front and the rear react the same amount. We don't want it reacting too much at one end or the other end. We want it to stay nice and level as it goes over there. But as far as garage setup is concerned, we'll call that job done. So I hope you enjoyed watching, and that's all from me. Until the next time.